Paul Flores, a defendant in Smart versus Flores, San Luis Obispo Superior Court case. My name is James R. Murphy Jr. I am an attorney with James R. Murphy Jr., a law corporation. The court reporter is Catherine Kaplanik, certified court reporter. And with Mr. Coates, who's in attendance, as he was at the prior deposition. And I see that Mr. Melvin Delamotte is present, apparently representing Mr. Flores to advise him on certain Fifth Amendment issues, is my understanding. Anybody wish to? I wanted to make a record that we had been taking the deposition of Ruben Flores, and to accommodate Mr. Delamotte and Mr. Flores' time constraints, we have interrupted his deposition, and the reporter has now set up, so we're going to basically make a record that we interrupted Ruben's by placing that record on the Paul Flores deposition record. Does that sound reasonable?
That's correct.
All right, Mr. Delamotte, do you wish to place anything on the record prior to the commencement of the deposition, sir?
I want to state for the record that, so that it's clear as you begin, that other than confirming Paul Flores' name, he does not intend to answer any questions, and on my advice will invoke the Fifth Amendment on all questions.
Okay. My office has done some research into this matter, and it's my understanding that California law requires that privilege must be asserted as to specific questions, that a blanket refusal to testify is inappropriate and illegal. The citation for the record is Warford, W-A-R-F-R-D versus Medeiros, M-E-D-E-I-R-O-S, 160 Calap 3rd, 1045. And obviously, if the position that you will instruct your client to take is that other than answering that his name is Paul Ruben Flores and nothing further, then we'll have a little problem here. And I think there's obviously going to be some type of appropriate remedy sought. So let me ask at this time that the witness be sworn.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in this matter should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Would you state your full name for the record, please?
Paul Ruben Flores,
And what is your date of birth, sir?
10/22/76,
Your social security number?
546-975858.
What is your present residence address?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
All right. It's my understanding. Let me go forward and provide some admonitions so we make a record. First of all, the lady sitting to your left is a court reporter who is empowered by California law to make a record of the proceedings. She types up on a transcript everything that is said by all the persons in this room. That compilation of information is placed into a booklet and is called a deposition transcript. The deposition transcript is then prepared and is presented to you for review and signature under penalty of perjury. If you make any significant changes in your deposition testimony, I will be permitted at the trial of this lawsuit to comment upon any material changes possibly to your detriment or embarrassment. Do you understand that?
Yes.
In addition, the oath that has been administered to you by the court reporter is the same oath that would be administered to you in a court of law, as if there were a judge present. And attached to the oath process is the penalty of prosecution for perjury should you lie under oath. Do you understand that admonition?
Yes.
As to perjury? And I want to ask you some questions. Are you under the influence of any medication which at this time would interfere with your ability to give clear and accurate testimony today?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
A deposition is a process by which I, as the attorney for the plaintiffs in the civil wrongful death action against you, am permitted to ask you certain questions. I do not want estimates. I want estimates when you answer questions and not guesses. Standard analogy used to explain the difference between an estimate and a guess is if I were to ask you to estimate for me the size of this table, you could give me a reasonable estimate based upon your ability to perceive things, and you could tell me that this table was a certain number of feet wide and a certain number of feet long. If I were to ask you what was the size of the desk at my home office where I live, you, having never been there, could not give me an estimate. Do you understand the difference between an estimate and a guess?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you what documents you have reviewed in preparation for your deposition testimony here today.
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Have you reviewed certain documents in preparation for your deposition testimony here today?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
For the record, I would indicate that the witness is repeatedly looking at and having his attention directed by Mr. Delamotte to an 8.5 inch by 11 inch piece of white paper with some black lettering which is upside down, and I can't read it from here, but I think I know what it says because the witness has read it into the record on a number of occasions. I would ask that a copy of that document that the witness has been reviewing be attached as an exhibit to this deposition and incorporated into the record. I would like to ask you a series of questions. You reported your Nissan truck stolen in San Diego recently. Is that correct?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
The record should reflect that when I asked that question, Mr. Delamotte placed his finger upon the 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with the Fifth Amendment invocation, and the witness read it into the record. I think probably the best way to do this, Mr. Delamotte, I'm not trying to be disrespectful of your position. I know of you and your reputation in our legal community. Nonetheless, I believe that the position that you are taking is clearly erroneous. I believe that it is a violation of the rules of civil proceedings. I know that you have done some civil work, but your instruction to your client to refuse to answer even the most simple and basic question, including questions that have absolutely no tendency in fact or law to incriminate him, is, I believe, misplaced. Nonetheless, if it is your position that Mr. Flores is not going to answer questions about his employment, his matriculation into Cal Poly, who his friends are, his relationship with his family members, things that occurred in his life prior to the date of the disappearance of Kristin Smart, vehicles that were available to him to use, things of that sort, perhaps I can cut to the chase and simply make a record as to the types of questions that I would be asked, and we can just have the blanket invocation. I get your position on that on the record, so when I go to a reviewing court, I have a clear and fair record.
As I indicated, he plans to answer that he will invoke the Fifth Amendment on all your questions. If you have questions to direct to my client, go ahead and ask questions. Save the speeches for later. Just ask the questions.
Okay, well, Mr. Delamotte, it's not a speech. It's a civil proceeding.
If you're not going to ask questions, we'll discontinue the deposition and leave. You're here to take a deposition. If you want to ask questions, go ahead.
I'm going to make a record of my position in this case, Mr. Delamotte.
You can make the record some other time. Ask the questions. That's what a deposition is for. Okay. Not to make a speech. You can make a speech to the court. You can do it in writing. You can do it orally. Ask the questions. We're here to answer the questions. We're required to do so. ask the questions or we'll leave.
All right, I'm going to make my record here. I've been advised that he's not going to answer the questions, so let's start asking the questions. Did you report your '85 Nissan truck stolen in San Diego recently?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
In May of '96, were you a student at Cal Poly?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Please provide me with the employment positions that you have held since you started high school.
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Are you presently employed?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Where do you presently reside?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Where did you attend high school?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
What is the name of your father?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
What is your mother's name?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
What is your sister's name?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Does your mother have a sister?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Prior to moving to the Arroyo Grande area, where did you reside?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Were you employed at Garland's in Grover Beach at any time in your life?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Have you ever been employed at a Union 76 station in the San Luis Obispo County area?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
What is the name of your supervisor? Strike that. What was the name of your supervisor at Garland's?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
What were the nature of your job duties at Garland's?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Did you cook hamburgers at Garland's?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
How old are you?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
In what year did you leave your... Strike that. In what year did you cease being a student at Cal Poly?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Could you provide me with the names of the persons with whom you have discussed the Kristin Smart case?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Were you arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol in 1996?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Did you attend a party at or near the Cal Poly campus in May of 1996?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Can you provide me with the names of persons who were present at the party in May of 1996, the party that immediately preceded the disappearance of Kristin Smart?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
I think that I have made a sufficient record that the witness is not going to answer any questions in connection with anything other than his name. I have been advised by Mr. Delamotte at the start of the deposition that the witness would not be answering any questions other than his name. The witness, on advice of counsel, is refusing to answer any and all questions. I have approximately 1,000 additional questions, but having had no success in finding out whether or not he cooked hamburgers at Garland's, I'm going to cease the questioning. I believe I've made a sufficient record to go to a court and seek appropriate relief. I want the record clear that I will be seeking sanctions from Mr. Delamotte, from his law firm, and from Mr. Flores as a result of what I believe to be a bad faith presentation of this witness and a wrongful assertion of the Fifth Amendment. At this time, I would propose the following stipulation: that the court reporter will prepare the original deposition and forward it to either Mr. Delamotte or Mr. Coates. To Mr. Delamotte. Mr. Delamotte will provide the deposition transcript to Mr. Flores. That Mr. Flores will have an opportunity to review his deposition, make any changes. That at the conclusion of the process of review of the deposition, Mr. Flores will be given an opportunity to make any changes he wishes to make. My office will be advised of the changes within 30 days of the making of those changes. That in the event the witness does not sign the deposition transcript under penalty of perjury, an unsigned copy could be used with the same force and effect as a signed copy. That the reporter would be relieved of her duties under the code. Do I have a stipulation?
So agreed.
I think that concludes the deposition.
I agree to that.
Who would like a copy?
We are going off record now at 11:22.
Could we go back on record? Mr. Delamotte, may I just
Going
have
on
one more
record.
second of your time so I can complete the record? Mr. Delamotte has before him a file of materials which I have no idea whether or not Mr. Flores did or did not review those documents. I simply want the record to reflect that he does have a file here. The only document that I saw Mr. Flores look at in my presence was the admonition which is attached. Thank you.
Anything to say?
This time, the Smarts are still pointing the finger at you. Do you have anything that you want to say that you think the public should understand about your position and why you haven't spoken out?